On a brisk autumn evening in the quiet town of Pine Hill, the usual calm was shattered by the piercing sound of police sirens racing down Willow Street. At the end of the street, nestled among tall, whispering pines, stood the home of Helena Whitlock. Known for its warmth and charm, the house was usually bathed in the soft glow of porch lights that beckoned neighbors and friends alike. But tonight, that light flickered uneasily, casting strange shadows across the yard, as though the house itself sensed the tragedy lying within. Leora Whitlock, Helena's only daughter, parked her car in the driveway, gripped by an inexplicable dread. She hadn't been able to reach her mother all day, an unusual occurrence that filled her with concern. Life had kept her busy, and she had initially assumed her mother was out, perhaps volunteering or attending one of her many community events. But as she climbed the front steps, a chill swept through her, intensifying her unease. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking open as though someone had left in a hurry. The house was silent as she stepped inside, her footsteps soft against the darkened hallway floor. The faint glow of the kitchen light cast an eerie shadow across the entryway, revealing that something was terribly wrong. A vase lay shattered on the living room floor. Furniture was askew and faint. Dark smudges on the carpet suggested a recent struggle. Panic gripped her, and she stumbled toward the kitchen, her heart pounding, her calls for her mother growing louder, more desperate, as she moved from room to room. In the kitchen, she stopped in her tracks, her heart seeming to freeze in her chest. Helena lay motionless on the cool tiles, her face pale and still, her arms bearing the unmistakable signs of a struggle. Leora's vision blurred as she tried to process the horror before her, the reality slowly sinking in. She dropped to her knees, reaching out instinctively, but the stillness of her mother's form confirmed the truth her heart refused to accept. Moments later, she fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed for help. Her voice was barely steady, broken by sobs as she attempted to convey what she had found. The dispatcher's voice on the other end was calm, soothing, urging her to stay on the line, but everything around her felt like a surreal nightmare. The piercing wail of sirens soon filled the street, and in an instant, the once quiet home was swarmed by flashing red and blue lights and the rapid footsteps of first responders. Uniformed officers and paramedics moved swiftly into the house, gently leading Leora away from her mother's body, shielding her from the sight as they began their examination. They worked quickly, confirming what Leora had feared. Helena was gone. Detective Fiona Rook arrived shortly after, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The disarray in the living room, the bruises on Helena's body, the open front door, all pointed to a violent struggle. As she began her preliminary investigation, her mind turned to questions that demanded answers. Who had done this? And what motive could anyone have had to harm a woman as beloved as Helena Whitlock? Outside, Leora sat on the front steps, draped in a blanket an officer had given her. She clutched it tightly, her mind reeling from disbelief, the weight of her loss pressing down on her. Helena had been her strength, her guide, the one person who had always been there for her. And now she was gone, leaving a void that seemed impossible to fill. As Detective Rook approached, Leora looked up, her face streaked with tears and marked by a mixture of sorrow and shock. Detective Rook began asking questions to help her piece together the puzzle of Helena's final hours, and Leora, though barely able to speak, tried to answer as best as she could. Memories of the previous days and weeks blurred together, details emerging slowly through the fog of grief. In the haze of her memories, one detail emerged that caught the detective's interest. Leora mentioned that her boyfriend, Alaric Doss, had been spending an unusual amount of time at her mother's house. He had been supportive, she thought, someone who genuinely seemed to care about her mother's well-being, but his presence had become frequent, bordering on intrusive. She had seen it as a gesture of kindness, but now, in light of recent events, she felt a chill run through her as she questioned everything she thought she knew. The thought of Alaric's visits lingered uneasily in her mind. Helena, she realized, had once mentioned feeling a bit uncomfortable with his presence, though she had brushed it off as nothing to worry about. Now, under the cold light of tragedy, those memories felt ominous. Could there have been something darker lurking beneath Alaric's quiet demeanor? As the detectives moved through the house, collecting evidence and photographing every detail, the reality of Helena's death settled like a heavy weight over Leora. The warmth and laughter that had filled this house, the countless memories of mother and daughter that seemed woven into every corner, had been shattered in a single night. And though she couldn't yet understand the full impact of her loss, Leora knew that the life she had shared with Helena would never be the same. Pine Hill was a town that valued its peaceful, predictable rhythms. Its people were known for their strong sense of community and family ties, and no one embodied those values more than Helena Whitlock. Helena was more than just a familiar face in Pine Hill. She was the warm, kind presence that drew others in, the neighbor everyone trusted, and the friend everyone confided in. She was known not only for her elegance, but also for her generosity. Her home was a gathering place, where she organized community meetings, hosted book clubs, and even ran charity bake sales. Her life seemed almost idyllic, one that many in town envied. Helena had faced her share of heartache and resilience. After her husband's untimely death, she dedicated herself to raising her only daughter, Leora Whitlock. Leora had inherited her mother's warmth and intelligence, though she expressed these qualities in her own bold, determined way. Leora had always been the type to take on challenges fearlessly, perhaps a trait she developed after watching her mother navigate life's adversities. Recently graduated from a prestigious law school and now working as a legal associate in the city, Leora was making her way in the world. Yet, no matter how busy her career became, she maintained a close relationship with her mother, often visiting Pine Hill for weekends filled with laughter, stories, and quiet moments in their cozy home. It was during one of these weekend visits that Leora introduced her boyfriend, Alaric Doss, to her mother. Alaric was a quiet, reserved young man with a mysterious aura that both intrigued and unsettled those who met him. Though he had a polite, soft-spoken nature, there was an intensity in his gaze, a brooding energy that hinted at something deeper. Growing up in a family that had been distant and cold, Alaric had never experienced the warmth and closeness that Leora shared with her mother. The affection between the two women fascinated him, drawing him into their world. He quickly became captivated not only by Leora's boldness and charm, but also by Helena's maternal grace and kindness. Alaric's fascination with Helena, however, quickly grew into something unusual. Whenever Leora wasn't around, he would find excuses to visit Helena, often under the guise of checking in or helping out. He would stop by unexpectedly with small gifts, a box of tea he thought she might like, a book on gardening, or a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked. Initially, Helena thought these gestures were harmless and kind, interpreting them as signs of his good nature and respect for family. However, as time went on, she began to sense something unsettling beneath his quiet demeanor. He seemed to linger a bit too long, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity that felt intrusive, almost possessive. The turning point came one summer afternoon when Helena was gardening in her backyard. Alaric had stopped by unannounced, carrying a thermos of iced tea. He sat beside her on the patio, watching her work with a focus that made her uncomfortable. As she tried to make light conversation, he leaned closer, commenting on how she reminded him of the mother he'd always wanted. There was a strange edge to his words, a hint of longing that made Helena feel uneasy. She brushed off his comment with a gentle laugh, trying to deflect the conversation, but Alaric's gaze didn't waver. Days later, Helena confided in Leora, casually mentioning that Alaric seemed to be a little too attentive. She tried to frame it as a light-hearted observation, not wanting to alarm her daughter. Leora, deeply in love with Alaric, brushed it off as nothing, assuring her mother that he was simply kind-hearted and appreciated their close family bond. But deep down, Leora began to notice subtle signs as well. Alaric's growing fixation on Helena manifested in small, odd behaviors. He began to withdraw emotionally from Leora, showing impatience and disinterest whenever she talked about her life or career, only perking up when Helena was mentioned. As the months passed, Alaric's obsession with Helena became increasingly clear, even to those outside the Whitlock family. Mrs. Enid Glade, the Whitlocks' elderly neighbor, frequently noticed Alaric's car parked outside Helena's house, often at odd hours. She once saw him pacing back and forth near the front door, staring at the house, as if waiting for something or someone. Enid, known for her curiosity and sharp intuition, began to suspect that Alaric's feelings for Helena were anything but normal. One night, Enid witnessed something particularly unsettling. From her bedroom window, she saw Alaric standing on the front lawn, clutching a bouquet of flowers, staring up at Helena's bedroom window with an expression that sent a shiver down her spine. He stayed there motionless for what felt like hours before finally placing the flowers on the doorstep and leaving. The following morning, when Helena found the bouquet, she assumed it was a gift from a friend and set it in a vase, oblivious to the dark undertone behind the gesture. Silas Finch, another neighbor, was also growing wary of Alaric's presence. Silas, a retired detective with a habit of observing the comings and goings in the neighborhood, couldn't ignore the frequent late-night visits and the tension that seemed to follow Alaric wherever he went. Silas had noticed Alaric's intense gaze, the way he would hover near Helena during neighborhood gatherings as though no one else in the world mattered. Once, Silas saw Alaric gripping a photograph of Helena at a charity event, staring at it with a fixation that Silas found unnerving. As Alaric's fixation with Helena deepened, His relationship with Leora became strained. She began to sense a distance between them, noticing that Alaric seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere whenever they were together. He grew increasingly possessive, questioning her loyalty and accusing her of neglecting him in favor of her career. These accusations stung, leaving Leora bewildered. Yet she tried to appease him, convincing herself that he was simply going through a difficult time. She didn't realize that his obsession with her mother was the true cause of his frustration and jealousy. The tension finally came to a head during one of the Whitlocks' family dinners. Leora had invited Alaric to join her and her mother for a meal, hoping to bridge the gap that had been growing between them. But as the evening progressed, Alaric's behavior grew more erratic. He seemed fixated on Helena, barely acknowledging Leora, his eyes following Helena's every movement. He made strange, almost poetic comments about her beauty and grace, praising her in ways that left both women feeling uncomfortable. Helena, sensing the shift, excused herself early, leaving Leora alone with Alaric, who fell silent and moody the moment Helena left the room. That evening, as Leora walked Alaric out, he made a chilling remark, muttering something about how he wished she could be more like her mother. The words echoed in Leora's mind long after he left, leaving her with a lingering unease that she couldn't shake. Leora's mind raced with confusion and doubt. She loved Alaric, but his fixation on Helena had grown disturbingly apparent, creating a rift between them that she couldn't ignore. The warmth and affection that once defined their relationship were now overshadowed by his strange behavior and unsettling obsession. She began to question whether she truly knew the man she had fallen in love with, and whether his admiration for Helena was more than just admiration. In the days that followed, Helena, too, felt increasingly wary of Alaric's attention. The kind gestures she once welcomed now felt intrusive, each one adding to the growing sense of unease. She started locking her doors, double-checking the windows, and found herself looking over her shoulder whenever she sensed movement outside. Pine Hill's tranquility had been disrupted by a shadow she could neither identify nor understand, and both mother and daughter felt its suffocating presence drawing nearer, hinting at a storm they were powerless to prevent. As the weeks passed, Alaric's fascination with Helena Whitlock evolved into something darker and more unsettling. It was no longer just admiration, it was an obsession, a fixation that he could neither control nor ignore. Each interaction with Helena seemed to deepen his need to be close to her, to feel her presence, and to imagine her as part of his own life. Alaric's mind became a chaotic mix of reality and fantasy, with Helena at the center of his every thought. He found himself drawn to her house at all hours, inventing excuses just to catch a glimpse of her, convinced that each moment spent with her was essential to his happiness. Alaric's obsession began to consume his daily routine. He spent hours analyzing every conversation he had with Helena, every word she said, replaying them in his mind and imagining deeper meanings in the most casual gestures. A simple smile or a friendly pat on the arm would fuel his fantasies, as if these small actions were proof of a bond that only he could understand. He began keeping a journal, filling pages with descriptions of Helena, her clothing, her expressions, the sound of her voice, each detail meticulously recorded as though preserving a sacred memory. This journal became his private sanctuary, a place where he could indulge his longing without judgment. Gradually, his behavior became more invasive. He began taking photographs of Helena from afar, capturing her in moments of solitude, watering her garden, reading on her porch, or looking out her kitchen window. He printed these photos, slipping them between the pages of his journal, adding to the growing shrine he had built in her honor. Sometimes he would stay up late, studying these images, tracing her features with his fingers, as if hoping to feel her presence through the paper. It was a ritual he kept secret, even from Leora, who had no idea that her boyfriend was drifting further from reality with each passing day. Helena, however, was beginning to sense that something was wrong. Alaric's visits, once seemingly benign, now felt intrusive, his gaze lingering too long, his presence unsettling. On several occasions, she found him in unexpected places around her property, once standing outside her garage, another time near her bedroom window, watching as if he had been waiting for her. When she asked what he was doing, he would quickly offer an innocent excuse, mentioning that he was looking for Leora or simply passing by. But the intensity in his eyes betrayed him, and Helena grew wary. The strange behaviors did not go unnoticed by the people around him. Mrs. Enid Glade, the elderly neighbor, had taken to watching Alaric from her window, noting the frequency of his visits and the hours he kept. She saw him standing in Helena's driveway, late at night, staring at the house, as if entranced. And on one occasion, she even witnessed him talking to himself in a low voice, gesturing as though rehearsing a conversation. Mrs. Glade's unease grew, and she began making notes in her diary. documenting his appearances and unusual actions, unsure if she should intervene or if it was simply harmless infatuation. Even Leora started to sense the growing distance between them. Alaric seemed preoccupied, distracted whenever they were together, often gazing off into the distance with a vacant look. He grew impatient with her, dismissing her concerns and refusing to engage in meaningful conversations. When Leora tried to discuss her work or her future, Alaric would shift the topic, often steering it back to Helena or the house. He seemed to care less about their relationship, as if the affection he once held for Leora had been entirely replaced by his fascination with her mother. During one of their dates, Leora noticed Alaric fiddling with his phone, scrolling through images with a slight smile. Curiosity got the best of her, and she asked to see what he was looking at. Alaric quickly locked the screen, his face turning tense, and muttered something vague about memories. The unease in Leora grew, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something precious between them was slipping away, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar presence that she barely recognized. The turning point came when Alaric, in a moment of reckless confidence, decided to test the boundaries of his obsession. One evening, he returned to Helena's house uninvited, a bouquet of lilies in hand. Helena's favorite flowers, something he had noted down weeks earlier. He left them on her doorstep, arranging them carefully with a note that read, "To the woman who brings light to every room she enters." Helena discovered the flowers the next morning, puzzled and slightly unnerved. She assumed they were from a friend, but the lack of a signature and the deeply personal message lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, and the sense of security she once felt in her own home began to fade. Meanwhile, Silas Finch, the retired detective, was also growing wary. He had observed Alaric's strange behaviors and his frequent visits, and his instincts told him that something was amiss. Silas had seen his fair share of troubling personalities during his career, and the intensity in Alaric's eyes reminded him of cases where admiration had turned into something much darker. Silas began his own quiet surveillance, keeping a close eye on Alaric whenever he saw him near the Whitlock house. One evening, he spotted Alaric standing in the shadows, watching Helena through her kitchen window, his face hidden in the dim light. Silas's gut told him that trouble was brewing, and he made a mental note to talk to Helena if things escalated. The final straw came during a family dinner. Leora had invited Alaric over, hoping to rekindle the warmth between them, but Alaric barely acknowledged her presence. His attention was fixated on Helena, his gaze intense and unwavering. As the evening progressed, he made several unsettling remarks about Helena's appearance, praising her in ways that felt overly familiar, even intimate. Both women noticed the shift, and Helena's discomfort was palpable. Leora, finally realizing the depth of his obsession, felt a wave of anger and betrayal. She confronted him afterward, demanding an explanation, but Alaric brushed her off, claiming she was overreacting. Alaric left that night, but the boundaries he had already crossed lingered in the air like a dark cloud over the Whitlock household. Helena locked her doors, double-checked her windows, and began carrying her phone everywhere, her sense of peace shattered by the realization that someone she had once trusted might be a threat. Leora, heartbroken and confused, tried to confront Alaric about his fixation, but he grew increasingly evasive, pulling away whenever she tried to reach him emotionally. With each passing day, Alaric's obsession only grew, fueled by a twisted mixture of admiration, desire, and jealousy. His journal entries became more erratic, filled with cryptic notes about Helena's daily activities, each page revealing a mind spiraling deeper into fixation. He began crafting fantasies in which she left everything behind to be with him, imagining a life where they were inseparable, bound by a connection he believed was fated. Reality became blurred, and Alaric convinced himself that Helena's silence was merely a sign of unspoken affection. The signs of his descent were clear to anyone who cared to look. But Alaric had isolated himself, locking away his true thoughts in the confines of his mind. To the outside world, he remained quiet, perhaps a bit distant, but no one could have guessed the extent of his delusions. Only Helena, Leora, and those closest to the Whitlock household sensed that something was horribly wrong, though they couldn't yet understand the depths of Alaric's obsession, and so Pine Hill remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing within its boundaries. A storm that would soon unleash consequences far beyond anything the town had ever known. As Alaric's obsession with Helena deepened, his behavior grew increasingly erratic, pushing him further into a world of delusion. His actions became so alarming that nearly everyone around him noticed, their initial doubts turning into genuine concern and, in some cases, outright fear. But Alaric, so consumed by his own fantasies, was blind to the suspicions he was stirring within the small town of Pine Hill. Mrs. Enid Glade, the Whitlocks' elderly neighbor, had always been a watchful figure in the neighborhood. She lived alone, her days spent tending to her garden, observing the quiet rhythms of life in Pine Hill. Enid had taken note of Alaric's strange comings and goings long before anyone else, sensing a change in his demeanor that left her uneasy. She often saw him lingering near the Whitlock house, standing motionless in the shadows, as though he were a part of the night itself. She would catch glimpses of him, staring at Helena's bedroom window or pacing near the porch, his posture tense and eyes fixed as if waiting for something she couldn't see. One particular evening, Enid decided to document his appearances, scribbling down dates and times in the margins of her notebook, a habit she had picked up years ago. She marked each sighting with growing concern, wondering if she should alert someone. The encounters became so frequent and disturbing that she even stopped by the Whitlock home one afternoon, hoping to speak with Helena. But Helena, likely trying to shield her daughter from worry, assured Enid that everything was fine, and that Alaric was merely overly attentive. Sensing Helena's discomfort, Enid refrained from pressing further, but continued her quiet surveillance, convinced that something sinister was unfolding. Meanwhile, Silas Finch, the retired detective, was watching Alaric with increasing suspicion. Silas had always been a keen observer, and after years in law enforcement, he trusted his instincts. He had noticed the quiet, almost obsessive way Alaric watched Helena during neighborhood events, his gaze unblinking, his entire presence seemingly tuned only to her. Silas often thought back to cases from his career, remembering individuals whose unchecked admiration for someone had spiraled into dangerous obsession. There was a haunting familiarity in Alaric's behavior, and Silas's mind raced with the potential risks Helena might face. One evening, Silas was out for a walk when he noticed Alaric's car parked down the street from the Whitlock home. It was well past midnight, and the street was bathed in darkness, lit only by the soft glow of streetlights. Silas approached cautiously, his heart pounding, as he watched Alaric sitting in the driver's seat, his gaze locked onto Helena's house. Silas moved closer, staying hidden in the shadows, and caught a glimpse of Alaric's face. His expression was one of unrestrained intensity, his eyes wide, lips parted slightly, as though entranced. Silas decided to approach Alaric, hoping to gauge his reaction, but as he made his way over, Alaric seemed to sense his presence. He quickly started the car, glancing in Silas's direction before speeding off, leaving the street empty and silent once more. Silas stood there for a moment, his mind heavy with concern. He resolved to speak to Helena about his suspicions, knowing that she needed to be aware of the potential threat lurking in her own backyard. In the meantime, Leora was also growing increasingly uneasy about her boyfriend's behavior. She began to notice subtle changes in his demeanor that unnerved her. The way he would tense up whenever she mentioned her mother, the strange flicker in his eyes when he spoke about Helena, and the possessive tone that seemed to seep into his words. On more than one occasion, she caught him staring off into space, muttering under his breath, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. One night, while Leora was at Alaric's apartment, she found herself compelled to search for answers. He had left her alone for a moment, and her curiosity drove her to open a drawer in his desk. Inside, she found a small leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with detailed entries about Helena. Every encounter, every glance, every word Helena had ever spoken to him was documented in obsessive detail. There were sketches of her face, attempts to capture her likeness, each one more desperate and distorted than the last. She flipped through the pages in horror, realizing the full extent of his fixation. The final straw came when she found a photograph, one she recognized instantly, of her mother standing in their garden, unaware that she was being watched. The photo was grainy, taken from a distance, and the sight of it sent a chill down Leora's spine. She returned the notebook to its place, her mind racing with the weight of her discovery. As much as she loved Alaric, she could no longer deny the truth. His feelings for her mother had crossed a dangerous line, and she had to confront him. When Alaric returned, Leora tried to keep her composure, but the tension in the room was palpable. Alaric seemed to sense her unease, his gaze narrowing as he watched her carefully. Leora felt a pang of fear as she realized just how much he had changed, how the man she once loved had become a stranger, someone capable of crossing boundaries she had never imagined. She left that night without a word, the weight of betrayal and fear pressing down on her as she walked into the cool night air, her mind filled with questions she was too afraid to ask. Back at the Whitlock home, Helena found herself growing more anxious with each passing day. The once safe haven of her home now felt tainted, shadowed by an unseen threat that she could neither define nor escape. She locked her doors and kept her curtains drawn, her sense of security eroding with each encounter. She became hyper-aware of her surroundings, flinching at every sound, every creak in the house. Her once restful nights were plagued by nightmares, her mind filled with images of Alaric's intense gaze and the feeling of being watched. One night, unable to sleep, Helena wandered through the house, checking locks and making sure everything was secure. As she reached the living room, she froze, her eyes drawn to a figure standing just beyond the window. Alaric was there, his silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of a streetlight. He stood still, his face hidden in shadow, but she could feel his eyes on her, piercing through the darkness. She felt a rush of fear, a primal instinct to flee, but forced herself to stay calm, watching him until he eventually turned and disappeared into the night. The following day, Helena made the decision to confide in Silas. She couldn't shake the feeling that Alaric was growing bolder, his actions more brazen, and she needed guidance. Silas listened intently, his expression darkening as she recounted the events of the past weeks. He assured her that he would keep an eye on Alaric, that he would do whatever it took to ensure her safety. But Helena could see the worry in his eyes. The unease had spread beyond her home, infecting those around her, as Pine Hill's quiet streets became shadowed by a fear that was growing harder to ignore. As Helena returned home, the weight of Alaric's obsession felt heavier than ever. She could feel it pressing down on her, suffocating her, an invisible presence that haunted every corner of her life. She sensed that something terrible was approaching, an event that would shatter the peace of Pine Hill. And all she could do was brace herself, hoping against hope that she would find a way to escape before it was too late. The ominous tension that had been building in Pine Hill finally reached its breaking point. On a chilly autumn evening, the town, wrapped in the early darkness of October, seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the storm about to unfold. Helena Whitlock had spent the day trying to keep herself busy, her nerves frayed after the recent encounters with Alaric. She had felt his presence lurking around her house, sensed his watchful eyes, and knew that any confrontation between them would likely end badly. But she also realized that avoiding him would do little to stop the escalating danger. That evening, as twilight settled over the neighborhood, Helena steeled herself. She locked all the doors, checking every window, hoping to create a sense of safety in her own home. She called Leora, urging her to stay in the city for the night, though she avoided explaining the real reason for her request. She didn't want to alarm her daughter, yet the fear gnawing at her had become impossible to ignore. Her instincts screamed that something terrible was coming, and she felt a strange, eerie calm settle over her as she braced herself for whatever lay ahead. The clock ticked past 9 p.m., and Helena heard a familiar sound that made her blood run cold. A gentle tapping at the front door. She froze, her heart pounding, as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. Alaric was outside. She knew it instinctively, and this time he wouldn't leave without confronting her. She could feel his presence through the door, an almost suffocating energy that seeped into the house, filling every corner with his unyielding obsession. After a moment's hesitation, Helena took a deep breath and walked toward the door. She hesitated only briefly before opening it, her face set in a determined expression. Alaric stood on the porch, his face shrouded in shadows, a strange intensity burning in his eyes. He held a bouquet of lilies in one hand, the same type he had left on her doorstep before, as if these flowers could express the twisted affection he felt. Helena met his gaze, her voice steady but cold, as she asked him what he wanted. Alaric's face twisted with a mixture of anger and longing, his voice low and trembling as he told her that he couldn't live without her, that he felt they were connected in ways no one else understood. He spoke of the bond he believed they shared, painting a delusional picture of a future where they would be together. In his mind, Leora had become an obstacle, a mere shadow of the woman he truly desired. As he spoke, Helena's fear turned to anger, her patience wearing thin. She told him to leave, to never come back, that his presence had become a dark cloud over her life, and that his obsession was nothing but a dangerous delusion. But instead of retreating, Alaric's face darkened, a dangerous glint appearing in his eyes as her rejection pushed him over the edge. In a sudden, violent outburst, Alaric pushed his way into the house. His calm veneer shattered. Helena stumbled back, struggling to maintain her composure as he stormed into the living room, his movements erratic, his breathing ragged. He began pacing, shouting accusations, his voice a mixture of despair and fury. He claimed that she had led him on, that every smile, every word had been a hidden promise, and now she was abandoning him. Helena tried to remain calm, her mind racing as she attempted to de-escalate the situation. She assured him that he was mistaken, that any bond he felt was purely in his mind, a fantasy, but her words seemed to fuel his rage. He became more erratic, knocking over furniture, his voice growing louder as he accused her of betrayal, of destroying his life. The man before her was no longer the Alaric she knew. He was a stranger, consumed by his own delusions. Realizing that reason would not reach him, Helena turned and bolted toward the kitchen, hoping to grab her phone and call for help. But Alaric lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her back with a force that made her gasp. His grip was tight, his face inches from hers, and she could see the madness in his eyes, a mixture of desperation and wrath. In that moment, she knew there was no escaping him. They struggled, each desperate to overpower the other. Helena fought with all her strength, her instincts kicking in as she tried to break free. But Alaric's grip was ironclad, and his strength, fueled by rage, was unyielding. He pinned her against the wall, his voice a low, menacing whisper as he insisted that if he couldn't have her, no one else would. In a final act of defiance, Helena spat words of defiance, her voice steady even as she faced the man who had transformed from her daughter's boyfriend into her own worst nightmare. Her words seemed to snap whatever control Alaric had left, and with a final frenzied burst of anger, he wrapped his hands around her neck, his face twisted with rage and sorrow. Helena struggled, her breaths coming in desperate gasps, her vision blurring as his grip tightened. Her mind raced with memories of Leora, of her late husband, of all the moments that had made her life worth living. She fought to the very end, refusing to let him take everything from her without a struggle. But as her strength faded, the darkness closed in and her world went silent. Alaric released his grip, stumbling back as Helena's body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. He stood there, his chest heaving, his mind struggling to process what he had just done. The room felt suffocating, filled with the weight of his actions. The lilies he had brought lay scattered on the floor, trampled and broken, a haunting symbol of the twisted love that had driven him to commit the ultimate act of violence. In a daze, Alaric backed away, his hands trembling, his thoughts a chaotic blur. He stared at Helena's still form, a wave of horror washing over him as he realized the depth of his actions. Yet, even in his shock, he felt a strange sense of fulfillment, as though he had taken possession of the one thing he had always wanted. In his deluded mind, he convinced himself that this was his final connection to her, a bond forged in tragedy. As he staggered out of the house, Alaric left behind a scene of devastation, the echoes of his rage and obsession lingering in the empty rooms. Pine Hill's serene silence was shattered, replaced by a dark shadow that would forever stain the town's memory. And while the world outside remained blissfully unaware of the horror that had unfolded, those closest to Helena would soon be drawn into the nightmare Alaric had created, their lives forever altered by a love that had turned deadly. The news of Helena Whitlock's tragic death spread through Pine Hill like wildfire, casting a dark shadow over the usually tranquil town. Friends, neighbors, and loved ones gathered in shock, mourning the loss of a woman who had been a pillar of kindness and warmth. But beneath the sorrow lay a simmering sense of fear and curiosity as questions arose about what or who had ended her life so violently. Detective Fiona Rook, a veteran investigator known for her keen intuition and unrelenting dedication, arrived on the scene with a heavy heart. She had met Helena briefly at a community event months earlier, charmed by her grace and sincerity. Now, as she surveyed the scene, Fiona's mind was steeled with a determination to uncover the truth. Her first steps were methodical, analyzing every piece of evidence, photographing every angle, and making sure no detail was overlooked. Inside the Whitlock home, the remnants of the violent struggle were chilling. The overturned furniture, broken vase, and scattered lilies painted a grim picture of Helena's final moments. The police forensic team carefully collected samples, dusting for fingerprints on the surfaces Alaric had touched. The bruising on Helena's neck, the pattern of her injuries, and the position of her body all indicated a struggle, suggesting she had fought valiantly against her attacker. Detective Rook's focus shifted to Helena's home office, where she found Helena's journal on the desk, its pages meticulously filled with thoughts, daily reflections, and recent worries. Skimming through the entries, Fiona found vague mentions of a persistent visitor. And though the name wasn't mentioned, Helena had noted feeling uncomfortable with certain attention. The entries were sparse, but the implication was clear. Someone had intruded on Helena's peace, slowly encroaching on her life with a familiarity she hadn't welcomed. Further investigation led the detectives to Leora, who was devastated but willing to help. Leora recounted the growing tension she had noticed in recent weeks, detailing Alaric's strange behavior and fixation on her mother. She hesitated at first, struggling to comprehend that the man she once loved could be responsible for such horror. But as she recounted his increasingly erratic behavior, the truth began to settle painfully in her mind. Leora spoke about the small gifts Alaric had left on Helena's doorstep, his intrusive visits, and his unshakable fixation. She described the notebook she had found in Alaric's apartment, filled with detailed observations about her mother. Though she hadn't confronted him about it, the memory of that discovery weighed heavily on her, confirming her darkest fears. As she recounted these details, Detective Rook listened intently, her suspicions crystallizing into a clear theory. After the initial interview, Rook met with the forensic team to discuss their findings. They confirmed that fingerprints matching Alaric's were found on multiple surfaces around the house, including the doorframe and the vase that had been shattered during the struggle. Analysis of the bruising patterns on Helena's neck also matched Alaric's hand size, a detail that added to the mounting evidence. Determined to pursue every lead, Detective Rook turned her attention to the neighbors, hoping to gather further insights. Mrs. Enid Glade, who had been Helena's neighbor for years, shared her observations with a grim expression. She revealed her notes, the diary where she had documented Alaric's frequent visits and unusual behavior. Enid recounted seeing him late at night, lurking near the Whitlock home, his silhouette framed ominously by the glow of streetlights. She described the chilling instance when she saw him standing in Helena's yard, holding a bouquet of lilies, staring up at her bedroom window with an intensity that left Enid sleepless for nights afterward. Another key witness, Silas Finch, provided further damning evidence. A retired detective himself, Silas had sensed something amiss in Alaric's behavior long before Helena's death. He shared his observations, describing Alaric's habit of loitering around the house and the night he had caught him sitting in his car, fixated on Helena's home. Silas mentioned the encounter he had with Alaric when he approached the car, only for Alaric to drive off without explanation. His testimony painted a disturbing picture of a man slowly unraveling, consumed by an obsession that had now claimed an innocent life. Back at the police station, Detective Rook reviewed the compiled evidence, piecing together the timeline of events. Alaric had visited Helena's house numerous times under the guise of checking in or helping out, while secretly fostering an infatuation that had spiraled out of control. His escalating behavior had reached a point where he could no longer distinguish reality from his own fantasies, leading him to a deadly confrontation. The lilies, a symbol of his twisted affection, were a reminder of the delusion that had taken hold of his mind. Rook decided it was time to bring Alaric in for questioning. As she prepared, she felt a surge of determination mixed with a sense of dread, aware that she would be facing a man whose psyche was fractured by obsession. She arranged the interrogation room meticulously, ensuring that every question would be framed to draw out the truth, to confront Alaric with the gravity of his actions. When Alaric was brought in, he appeared disheveled, his eyes shadowed and vacant, as though lost in a world of his own making. At first, he tried to maintain a calm demeanor, insisting that he had merely been a concerned boyfriend who had wanted to help Helena. But as Detective Rook presented the evidence, the fingerprints, the witness statements, the details from his notebook, his facade began to crumble. Each piece of evidence chipped away at Alaric's composure, revealing glimpses of the turmoil within. He became defensive, shifting from denial to anger, his voice trembling as he tried to justify his actions. He claimed that Helena had encouraged him, that her kindness was a signal of deeper affection, a secret bond he believed they shared. He spoke of the unspoken connection between them, a connection that, in his mind, justified every invasion, every gesture, every violent impulse. As Rook continued pressing, Alaric's calm completely disintegrated. He recounted that final confrontation in vivid detail, his voice wavering as he described how Helena had betrayed him by rejecting him. He painted himself as a victim of unrequited love, unable to see the horror in his own words as he spoke of that moment when his rage took over, when he had no choice but to ensure she would belong to him forever. His confession, though twisted and diluted, was enough to confirm his guilt. In the aftermath of the interrogation, Detective Rook sat alone in her office, reflecting on the case that had shaken the very foundations of Pine Hill. She had uncovered a tragedy rooted not in love, but in control, in a warped sense of ownership that had destroyed the lives of all involved. Helena Whitlock had been a victim not only of Alaric's obsession, but of a society that had allowed warning signs to go unchecked. A community that had ignored the dark undercurrents until it was too late. As the investigation closed, Rook's thoughts returned to Leora, who now faced the daunting task of rebuilding her life in the shadow of her mother's murder. The evidence, the testimonies, and the confession had painted a picture of a man consumed by his own fantasies, a man who had taken everything from her in one night of senseless violence. In the days that followed, Detective Rook made it her mission to ensure that Alaric faced the full weight of justice. that his actions would not go unpunished. Pine Hill would never be the same, marked forever by the darkness that had seeped into its peaceful streets. But amidst the sorrow, Rook hoped that the lessons learned from Helena's death would echo through the town, a reminder of the dangers lurking beneath seemingly innocent obsessions. And though justice would be served, the scars left by Alaric's actions would remain, a haunting testament to a love that had turned deadly. As the final pieces of evidence were documented and sealed, Detective Fiona Rook felt a solemn weight lift from her shoulders. The investigation into Helena Whitlock's death had been exhaustive, but there was a sense of closure that came with the completion of every report, every analysis, and every witness testimony. The evidence against Alaric Doss was damning, leaving no doubt about his guilt. He would face trial, and Fiona knew the outcome was inevitable. Alaric's actions, born of obsession, twisted by delusion, had led him to murder, and now justice awaited him. The courtroom, on the day of Alaric's trial, was filled with members of the Pine Hill community, friends, and neighbors of Helena. Some were there out of a sense of respect for Helena, while others came to bear witness to the tragic culmination of Alaric's actions. The townspeople, once blissfully unaware of the darkness brewing in their midst, were now grappling with the shock that someone they knew, someone they thought was ordinary, was capable of such a heinous act. Throughout the trial, Alaric's defense attempted to paint him as a man suffering from deep psychological distress. His attorney argued that his actions stemmed from unresolved trauma, that his obsession was a manifestation of loneliness and desperation rather than malice. But the prosecution, armed with Alaric's confession, the photographs, his notebook, and the testimonies of people like Mrs. Enid Glade and Silas Finch, presented a narrative that left little room for sympathy. Alaric's obsession with Helena had been deliberate, calculated, a desire that had mutated into a need for control, one he had acted upon with violent determination. When Leora took the stand, her testimony was a poignant reminder of the personal devastation Alaric's actions had caused. She spoke of the initial charm and kindness she had seen in him, the gradual descent into possessiveness and fixation, and finally, the terrifying realization that the man she had loved was consumed by an obsession with her mother. Her voice was steady, but her words cut through the courtroom with raw emotion, revealing the lasting scars left by Alaric's betrayal and the loss of her beloved mother. As the trial drew to a close, the judge delivered a sentence that reflected the gravity of Alaric's actions. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courtroom fell silent as the sentence was read, a collective sense of relief mingling with the lingering sorrow that no verdict could truly erase. Justice had been served, but for Leora and the residents of Pine Hill, the scars of that night would remain, an unspoken reminder of the fragile line between love and obsession. With the case officially closed, Detective Rook allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had worked countless cases throughout her career, but this one had left a profound impact on her. Helena's death had revealed a stark truth about the dangers lurking behind seemingly innocent affections, about the destructive power of unchecked obsession. It was a case that underscored the importance of recognizing warning signs, the small, seemingly insignificant details that, if ignored, could lead to catastrophic consequences. For Leora, life after the trial was a journey of healing. The weight of her mother's absence hung heavily in her heart, a void that no amount of time or justice could fill. Yet, amid the grief, Leora found strength in honoring her mother's memory. She poured herself into work, joining organizations that promoted mental health awareness, hoping that through her efforts, others might be spared the pain her family had endured. She became an advocate, speaking openly about her experience, sharing her story as a reminder that love must be built on respect and understanding, not on possession or control. The town of Pine Hill, too, was forever changed. Helena's murder had shaken the community to its core, forcing its residents to confront the reality that darkness could exist in even the most familiar faces. In the months following the trial, neighbors became more vigilant, more attuned to the lives of those around them, recognizing that sometimes the most dangerous individuals are those who blend in the best. A renewed focus on community and mental health emerged, as local leaders organized workshops and support groups, hoping to create a safer environment for everyone. Through it all, Helena's memory lingered as a quiet, gentle presence in Pine Hill. The warmth and kindness she had brought to the community became her legacy, a testament to a life lived with love and generosity. In her honor, the town established the Helena Whitlock Memorial Scholarship, a fund to support young women in Pine Hill pursuing careers in social work and mental health. The scholarship became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, hope and healing could emerge. For Detective Rook, The case served as a reminder of her duty not only to seek justice, but to advocate for understanding and compassion. She resolved to approach future investigations with an eye not only for the facts, but also for the complexities of human emotion, recognizing that every case held a story waiting to be told, a story that might offer a glimpse into the unspoken struggles that so many face. The lessons from Helena's case became a part of her own approach to life and work, grounding her in the belief that justice, though essential, must be tempered with empathy. In the end, the murder of Helena Whitlock became more than a cautionary tale. It was a catalyst for change. It reminded those who knew her that love, when twisted by selfish desire, could become dangerous, even deadly. But it also underscored the importance of awareness, of community, and of the quiet strength needed to rebuild after loss. Through Leora's advocacy, the town's renewed focus on mental health, and the establishment of Helena's scholarship, her spirit lived on, a beacon of light guiding Pine Hill through the darkness left in the wake of her death. And so, as time moved forward, the people of Pine Hill carried with them the lessons of Helena's life and death, bound by a shared commitment to protect and uplift one another. The town had been scarred, but in those scars, they found resilience, a renewed commitment to kindness, and a legacy that would endure for generations to come. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.